Hi everyone and welcome back. So I've had a few requests over the past couple of months for a video on how I paint my yellow. So this is a method that I've used on a couple of armies in the past. I've painted a Mechanicum army in this scheme and also most recently my Imperial Fists army. So hopefully you find this useful. If you do, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel and let's get into it. So I'm going to start off by giving it a nice even coat of German red-brown primer from Vallejo. I have already primed this model black just with a rattle can. Not entirely necessary, but I do just like to do that just to make sure all of the shadows are filled. And then I'm going to move on to some white ink and I'm going to mix some of that into the primer which is left over in the airbrush. So I think you can see I put 4 or 5 drops of white ink in there. Obviously it'll depend how much paint you've still got in your airbrush cup as to how much ink you add. And I'm just going to give the model a general kind of zenithal highlight from above, just hitting the upper areas and leaving the darker red primer in the shadows. Once that's done, I'm just going to add a touch more white ink, another few drops, and just mix that into the airbrush cup. Then I'm just going to hit the uppermost areas with this before moving on to some pure white ink for the final highlights. I think I'm spraying at about 25 psi for kind of the whole of this process, and I'm using the Iwata HPCS, which I think's got a 0.35mm nozzle. Then for the final step of the pre-shade, I'm just going to use some pure white ink straight from the pot. This is not diluted or anything. I'm just going to hit the uppermost areas, so like the tops of the shoulder pads and the kind of the raised areas of the legs, just the parts that would catch the most light. If you don't have ink or if you don't have access to kind of artist ink, I'm using the Daler Rowney ones, but if you can't get hold of those, you can just use a white primer, mix the white primer into the red brown and then do some pure white primer. I just prefer to use the ink because I think it goes through the airbrush nicer. But then for the main yellow colour on this one, I'm going to be using Brilliant Yellow ink from Daler Rowney. If you don't have access to the inks, again, you can use a substitute. So for example, the Imperial Fist Contrast paint, and I'm sure there's an equivalent kind of speed paint from Army Painter that you could use, which would work just as well. But in this case, I'm going to be using the ink and I'm going to be diluting it 50-50 with airbrush thinner. And the technique I use here is to spray very little and do quite a few coats, so probably 3 or 4 coats. You can see from the airbrush that I've just put into shot there, you can see I'm kind of barely pulling back on the trigger, so there's very little of this coming out. I'm just kind of building it up in thin layers. Just remember to let each layer dry properly before you apply the next one. I've used a hairdryer kind of in between each layer here just to speed up the process. You don't need to wait ages, but just blast with a hairdryer and then it's ready to go for the next one. So once you've done a few thin coats, you should have something that's looking something like this. So it's quite a bold yellow, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just giving the model a coat of gloss varnish because I'm going to be putting some oil washes over this in just a moment, so it's just to protect that ink. Ink can be quite delicate, so it does help to varnish it after you've applied it if you can. I'm then going to mix up a raw umber oil wash. So this is just a small amount of oil paint mixed with white spirits or mineral spirits, just in a little metal container that you can see on the side of the shot there. And I'm just going to apply this into all of the recesses. So the purpose of the gloss varnish, as well as to protect the ink, is to help this flow into all of the recesses, and it also makes it easier to clean up if you make any mistakes. So yeah, just kind of dot it into all of the recesses, wait for it to dry, and then we can come back afterwards and clean up any mistakes. I'm then going to take some clean white spirit. If you're in the States, this is probably called mineral spirits, but it's just the cheap stuff that you'd buy at the DIY store. And I'm just using a makeup sponge just to clear away any of the any areas where that oil wash has gone onto where I don't want it to be. I'd recommend leaving the oil wash to dry for about 30 minutes before doing this. If you do it straight away, kind of before the spirits have evaporated, you'll find that the sponge kind of pulls the wash kind of back out of the recesses, which obviously you don't want. But if you leave it so that those spirits evaporate and it just leaves the oil paint in the recesses, you'll find it's much easier to do the cleanup. And then I'm just using a small brush just to do the same thing, just on the smaller areas where the sponge couldn't reach properly. The sponge is great for kind of the big flat surfaces, but sometimes you do need to use a small brush just to get into the areas that the sponge can't reach. And then once that's all cleaned up, you should be left with something that looks roughly like this. I have given the model a coat of matte varnish here, just over the gloss, but that's purely for the benefit of the video because it's quite hard to film a really kind of glossy miniature and it's not very nice to look at on camera. So yeah, I've given that a coat of matte varnish now. Usually I'd do it later in the process. So then moving on to some regular acrylics. So I'm just giving all of the leather parts a quick base coat with Baneblade Brown from Citadel. There's not much on this miniature. I think it's only the pistol holster and the strap for his bolter. And then just going to give those same areas a quick coat with Wildwood Contrast. So I've thinned this 50-50 with contrast medium, just so that it's not too strong. And then once that's dry, I'm going to take the same Baneblade Brown that we used for the base coat, and I'm just going to give it a basic kind of highlight just on the edges of the holster and on the strap there. I'm going to take some Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm just going to base coat all of the areas that I want to be black. So I think on this miniature it's mainly the gun casing and the soft armor joints kind of at the kind of the knees and the elbows and the hips, and also the plume on the top of his head. I think I actually forgot to do that here, so you might see that magically kind of appear painted later on, but it's the same technique that I'm using here. Then I'm just going to go over that with some Black Templar contrast. This is not diluted at all, straight from the pot. And yeah, just go over all of those areas that you just painted grey. Just going to go back to the Mechanicus Standard Grey and just give all of those areas just a basic highlight. So not picking out every single detail because the contrast paint does a lot of that for you, but just kind of the highest areas really. And you should be left with something roughly like this. I did at this point realise that I forgot to put some decals on, or transfers. I should have done this when the gloss varnish was still on, but I forgot, so I'm doing it now. I'm then going to move on to the eye lenses. So I'm going to be using dark Prussian blue, blue-green and some white from Vallejo for this. So I'm going to start off with a base coat of dark Prussian blue. I'm then going to add a bit of the blue-green into that previous paint. And then I'm going to use the blue-green by itself, followed by mixing some white into the blue-green, and just kind of build up some layers, just getting smaller and smaller with each layer, and it gives you this nice kind of glowing effect for the eyes. Next up is some Rhinox hide, so I'm just going to take this and a small brush and just kind of go over all of the armor panels and just add a few kind of random like chips and scratches just in places where you think the armor might get damaged the most. You can use like a sponge for this if you like, but on kind of smaller models I do prefer to use a brush just because I feel it gives a bit more control. But sometimes if I use a sponge it kind of goes into places where I don't want it to go. I like using the sponge weathering on bigger models, so like dreadnoughts and vehicles and things like that, but I do prefer to do this with the brush on kind of like Space Marine power armored size models. This is one of those things where you can kind of add as much of it or as little of it if you like, as you like. Some people like a really heavily weathered kind of chipped look. Others prefer more of a clean look, so you could even just skip this step entirely if it's not kind of your thing. But if it is, once you've painted those kind of chips on, I'm just going to go back to some raw umber oil paint. I'm not going to dilute it this time into a wash, but I'm just going to kind of dab a little bit onto kind of not every single one of the chips, but just some of the kind of the more prominent ones. And then I'm just going to take a brush that I've dipped in some clean white spirit. So as you can see, this brush is absolutely knackered. So don't go using your nice brushes for this, but yeah, just dip it into some white spirit. I'm kind of working on like a black piece of card, which I just use as like my video backdrop, so that's kind of ideal just to kind of wipe off the excess kind of white spirit onto there, as you can see like I'm doing now, and then just kind of drag the brush down from the point where you added the little tiny kind of blob of oil paint, and it should give you a nice streak. If you do make any mistakes, don't worry, just take a bit more of the spirits on your brush, and then you can go back in and it should kind of be easy to remove. You'll see, I think here where I make a bit of a mistake with the streaking. So yeah, just take the brush and just go in a downward motion in the kind of the natural way that a streak would form. As you can see, I've got some there where I don't want it, so I'm just going back in with the white spirit and it comes straight off. And as I mentioned earlier, I did apply a matte varnish over the gloss varnish that we had earlier, but that was only for the benefit of the video. So usually I wouldn't do that, so the model would still be glossy at this point. So I'd recommend leaving that gloss varnish on until at least after you've done this stage, because it just makes cleaning up any mistakes that much easier. And then just because I'm going to be doing a brown base on this model, I'm just giving that a coat of the Rhinox hide that we used to do the chips. Obviously you base yours however you want, but this is just for the basing scheme that I'm doing on this model. I'm then just going to base coat all of the metallic parts at this point. So I'm going to be using scale 75 black metal for all of the silver and scale 75 decayed metal for all of the gold. Obviously, if you have a metallic recipe that you're kind of happy with already, you could use that instead. Lots of different ways to do metallics. So this is just to kind of show you how I did it for this specific model. Then I'm going to move on to some edge highlights on the yellow. So for this I'm going to be using Dawn Yellow from Citadel, and this takes a while, I'm not going to lie. It does take a long time, so you could, if you wanted to save some time, just hit the most prominent edges. I think on this one I painted pretty much all of them, but if you were painting an army, for example, instead of one miniature, you could always just hit the kind of the upper areas, or even just not do it at all. A lot of people don't, and it still looks, their armies still look great. So yeah, if the edge highlighting kind of look isn't for you, just skip this step and move on to the next one. So for a minute or two, I'll leave you with some soothing music whilst I edge highlight this Space Marine. I didn't want to cut this out because I know some people like to see the kind of the process of how I do it. But if you don't want to watch this, no worries, just skip ahead a minute or two and we'll be back to painting the rest of the miniature. And then once that's done, you should be left with something that looks roughly like this. And then just going to take some pure white paint, and I'm just going to, you'll see what I do here. So I'm just kind of doing like a dot on the kind of like the sharpest edges and on like the very kind of like the points of the armor that would reflect the most light. So this is really, really kind of subtle. You don't want to overdo this. So just yeah, like yeah, as you can see there, like the tip of the helmet and like the part of the kind of the face mask that's kind of sticking up, any kind of just kind of sharp points of the chips that we've painted. Yeah, just a tiny dot of white, and it just gives that illusion of kind of light reflecting off of those parts. I'm then just going to do a very similar thing to the black kind of gun casing, just using Celestra Grey for this, just to kind of hit the very edges and the very kind of tips. And I'm just doing this on the plume on the head as well. When I was painting this, my daughter was watching me for a little bit, and she said, "Daddy, why does he have a brush on his head?" And I didn't really have an answer for it, to be honest. One thing I will just mention here is, because I've already matte varnished the model kind of earlier in the process, usually what I would do is I would highlight all of the yellow and the black before doing any of the metallics. So I'd apply the matte varnish kind of once all of the highlights were done on the non-metallic parts. Then I'd give it a matte varnish, and then I'd do the metallics. The order's kind of a little bit mixed up here because I varnished it earlier in the process, but yeah, just something to be aware of, because if you put a matte varnish over your metallics, it will dull them down quite a lot. And I've just used heavy metal and speed metal from scale 75 just to highlight the silver areas. And then for the gold, I've used Necro Gold and Peridot Alchemy from scale 75. So we're almost there with this one. I'm just going to finish off the base. It's not really part of the yellow scheme, but I like to include the basing, because some people might see the thumbnail image and think, oh, I wonder how you do that base. And then if I don't show it in the video, some people might get a little bit upset. So so yeah, hopefully it's useful for some of you, me leaving this in. So I'm just giving the base a dry brush of Karak stone over the Rhinox hide that I applied earlier. And then I'm just using these two pigments, so Graveyard Dirt and Stand Up Rust. These are from Absalom 502. So I've applied quite a bit of the Graveyard Dirt, and then the Rust I've kind of applied kind of more sparingly, just kind of in kind of patches just around the base. Don't be afraid to get a little bit of this on the feet, just to kind of tie the model into the base. Yeah, so just kind of blending it into the base there. And then of course the most satisfying part of any paint job, painting the base rim. So I'm just using a matte black for this. I think this is Vallejo Model Color Black. This gives a nice matte finish. Then I've just added a couple of tufts from Army Painter, and that is it. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I've got lots more videos planned for this year. Apologies, they've been a bit slow coming out recently, but things should get a bit more regular over the next few months. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming ones. Just want to give a quick shout out to our friends at Union County Games in Exeter. If you're ever in the southwest of England and you need a space to play your games, or if you need some hobby supplies, pop into UCG and Lewis will help you out. And once again, thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.